that over there. That's all right with you.
It's not going to go off or anything. It doesn't vibrate, I don't think. I hope. Oh, man. I'll have this place torn up before I'm done. Hi, everybody. I am an alcoholic. My home group is the Thursday night study group in Fort Lauderdale, and my name is Brian Haynes. Glad to be here. Glad you're all here. I have done a few of these now. In the area. I'm a big book thumper. I'm much more comfortable talking about the big book. I hate talking about myself, and that's just how it is. I do not like to share. I'm much more comfortable breaking down the book, telling you what I think it means, in that environment. But anyway, these are good for me, I think. I learn something about recovery every time I go through one of these. I sometimes learn something about myself every time I go through one of these. How many of you are here tonight and were not here last week? Wow, a bunch of you. Okay. All right. So last week I more or less told my story. Mostly because I was struggling in AA for the first few years because I didn't know that I hadn't taken step one. I really hadn't. I had not really fully admitted to myself that I was powerless over alcohol. I was saying that I was powerless over alcohol, and I was saying my name is Brian and I'm an alcoholic, but I really didn't know what that meant. And I didn't know that I didn't know what that meant. That's the toughest thing. Like most of the stuff that I find this over and over again in sobriety is like the things that I'm sure that I know, wrong. And the things that I don't know, I don't even know that I don't know. Like it's this constant like evolution of coming into new information that was previously right in front of me had I only known that I didn't know it. So there's always that kind of a thing going on, and so I'm in AA and I know that alcohol is no good for me. I mean all you have to do is look at my life and you know that alcohol is no good for me. But that doesn't mean that I understood what it meant to be powerless. And it wasn't until some big book thumping old timer started breaking down the doctor's opinion, and I learned, and I don't know why. I mean, the doctor's opinion is in the very beginning of the big book. You'd think it'd be like one of the first things that people read, but I didn't read the doctor's opinion when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. Anytime I went to read the big book, I started on page 1. War fever ran high in this New England town, which we new young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned. I mean, it is not, and there's a couple of things wrong with that. Number one, I was just actually discussing this with a newcomer this week. The first thing is it sets the book up in my mind. It set the book up as an autobiography or a novel. And that's not what the book Alcoholics Anonymous is. It's a textbook, right? And so in my mind, I have already misunderstood what the big book is as I'm reading it because I'm starting it at Bill's story and I don't have any information. And so what Joe and Charlie did at the Big Book Seminar is that they broke down the big book and they made it make sense to people. And one of the things that they were talking about when I first arrived at a Big Book Seminar with Joe and Charlie was allergy of the body, obsession of the mind. They were talking about the doctor's opinion. They were explaining how alcoholics have a twofold illness. A physical illness, once I take a drink, my body reacts with a physical craving for more. And that reaction never occurs in a normal drinker. It is something that is very distinct to alcoholics, and it explains why once I start drinking, I cannot control my drinking. If that were my only problem, then the solution would be to quit drinking. Right? And actually, if that is your problem, then the solution is to quit drinking. If you find you can't quit drinking, then we talk about powerlessness and alcoholism. Because I absolutely could not drink. I couldn't stay sober even a month. I remember, and since, and I'm going to tie the first and second step. I'm probably going to talk about steps 1 and 2 the whole evening, and I'm probably going to talk more about steps 1 and 2 and less about my story. But steps 1 and 2 go together in a very real way because, well, first of all, let's finish the description of the problem. The problem is I'm allergic to alcohol physically, so once I take a drink, I can't control it, and something in my mind does not allow me to stay away from the first one. I have some form of malfunction in my brain that allows me to remember all of the good times I had drinking and none of the bad times. And even if I can remember the bad times, those memories seem to be less vivid in my mind. So what happens is that just before I take a drink, hey, look, the day after getting out of jail, I'm crystal clear. I can't drink. This was the cycle. I woke up in jail, crystal clear. I can't drink anymore. I am done with that drinking. They would let me out, which is part of the problem. And I'd know on my way out, I'd go, all right, I got to stay sober. If I don't stay sober, I'm coming back, right? I know that. I'm not stupid. I figured that out at 17 years old. I'm not an idiot. So I would leave the jail knowing that if I drank, I was going to end up, doing the same thing and coming back. I don't have any AA jargon. I haven't heard doing the same thing over. I don't know any of this stuff. I'm just a human being in the world knowing after 5 times going to jail after benders that if I drink, I'm going to go back to jail. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure that out. And I would stay sober for a day, a week, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, sometimes a month. But what happens is that somewhere in that time, and sometimes I would do it after 2 days, and sometimes it would take 3 weeks. But what happens on the day that it occurs, the day the drink occurs, my mind remembers what alcohol does for me, and it completely suppresses what alcohol has done to me. So I don't remember the lost jobs and the bounced checks and the disgusted family and friends and the jail cell and the cop car and the impound and I don't remember those things just before I take a drink. At the moment that I'm convincing myself to take a drink, I'm telling myself some kind of story that sounds perfectly reasonable to me in the moment of how it's only going to be tonight and nobody's going to know. Right? Yeah. I've never taken a drink and had that be the case. Not once, right? But just before I take a drink, I believe some fairy tale like that. And so my mind seems to have a form of insanity. And so when the second step says, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity, that's what they're talking about, right? When I was new, I would hear the things that people talked about in AA about insanity. And I know that a lot of us are crazy, especially Jeannie, in a lot of ways other than alcohol. You're welcome. But that's not what the second step is talking about. The second step isn't talking about, because, look, sometimes my problem understanding AA is the fact that I think I already know what you're talking about, right? So you said we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, and I used a reference in my mind for what you were talking about. I know what you're talking about. You're talking about all those crazy, stupid things when I did when I was drinking. I understand insanity. You're going to restore me from that. Great. It's not what I'm talking about, right? It's not what they're talking about. Or some people were like, hey, some people are offended that you called them crazy. I mean, I could never be offended by that because I have memory. But some people would be offended if you called them crazy. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, don't call me crazy. I know that I'm messed up when I'm drinking, but other than that, I'm just fine. But in either case, they're talking about insanity as being the behavior after I start drinking. That's not what they're talking about. Of course, I'm crazy after they start drinking. Alcohol is a sedative, right? It lowers the inhibitions. And if you drink enough of something that lowers your inhibitions, you're going to do some crazy, stupid shit. I mean, it's just a fact. That you don't have to be. That's not crazy. That's not insanity. That's behavior induced by drinking a sedative, right? That's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about in the second step, being restored to sanity, is being restored to the ability to see the truth about the first drink. That was my problem. I had plenty of experiences drinking that made it crystal clear in my mind that it wasn't a good thing for me, that I should absolutely never do it again, that if I ever did, I know what the consequences are. The problem is that after the sting of the last time goes away, my brain doesn't hold on to all of those consequences. And it believes something that's not true that enables me to drink. Now, I've had discussions about this insanity before the first drink with people who say, oh, no, well, I drank on purpose. I drank intentionally. It wasn't that I believed a lie. I knew what would happen, and I still drank. And the truth is that was the case for me in the end as well. I mean, I at the end it became hard to put up any defense at all because I sort of knew, based on experience, that I was going to end up drinking anyway. And so why fight it off in this moment when I really, 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 really want to? And so I would give up a lot easier in the end because I knew it was sort of inevitable that I would start drinking again. But even in those situations where usually the words that come out of my mouth, and I'm going to try to not be offensive. I know the sign over there, lack of profanity offends no one. I usually don't mind offending people, but I'm going to try not to. But screw it, I'll say. That's not really what I would say in the moment, right? I would say something else, but screw it does the job, right? So what I would say after thinking about drinking all day and really, really, really wanting to drink is I would say, screw it, I don't care. Screw it, I don't care. I'm going to drink and I don't care what happens to me. And here's the thing. No, that doesn't fit the definition. It doesn't seem to fit the definition of insanity, right? Which is believing a lie just before I take the drink. But here's the thing. I would, at the end of that drink, which was usually several days later, sometimes a week, but at the end of that drink, I would end up in jail. And I would wake up on the cold concrete floor of the Broward County Jail, right? And I've never, ever woken up there and said, yep, totally cool, exactly what I wanted to happen. Like, that's never what it's never been okay. That's never been okay. So even the F it, I don't care, right, is actually a lie. Because I did care. Every time that I ended up in jail again, I did care. It wasn't where I wanted to be. And so even that was a lie. It took me a little while to see that. Even when I thought that I was drinking on purpose, even that was just crazy, insane nonsense that I could tell myself to give up fighting and just go ahead and succumb to the drink. And so the second step came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. That's the solution to the problem. That's what, and here's the thing. Sometimes, and so that brings up the whole spiritual concept. That brings up the whole thing that everybody wants to debate and struggle with. I believe, I don't believe, I believe in this, but I don't believe in that. I don't believe he will. There's all kinds of things. There's all kinds of things that people hold on to that keep them from coming to believe that a power greater than themselves can restore them to sanity. Because it doesn't say you have to believe in God. It sounds like this big trick. If you're new in Alcoholics Anonymous and you're hearing, the steps and you kind of get a sense from the traditions and the people's stories that there's a lot of diversity in people's beliefs and approach to understanding of God. But as you look at the steps, it all sounds like a trick to get you into, and most of that is because this is a very strange place that we're in. This fellowship, Alcoholics Anonymous, 12-step programs, no matter which one you're in, they're a very strange thing because most of us have bumped up against spirituality before getting to Alcoholics Anonymous. And in most cases, when we bump up against spirituality, it's usually a religion or a church or something of that sort. And usually there is a particular idea that you must subscribe to in order to adopt that doctrine, that and have that work for you and fit in with that society. And so, again, it's one of those things. It's what I'm already listening for. Right? So I get to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm already listening for, I hear you saying it's a power greater than myself, and I hear you saying that I don't have to believe in anybody else's God, but I already know that can't be true because I've never had that experience before, right? And so I bring what I think I already know to Alcoholics Anonymous, and it doesn't fit. The thing about Alcoholics Anonymous that I love, the thing that I think that makes it work for the diverse set of beliefs that it works for, is the second step, is the fact that you don't have to believe in anything. As a matter of fact, our book even says, this floors me, but our book even says that being an atheist is not necessarily an obstacle to having a spiritual experience. So what? Like, that doesn't even make any sense. Being an atheist is not an obstacle to having a spiritual experience, which on the face just seems ludicrous and contradictory. But yet, it's true. And so where does this come from? I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, and I heard that Alcoholics Anonymous was created by alcoholics for alcoholics, right? And so I'm imagining that somewhere on the planet, two drunks got together, invented a thing called Alcoholics Anonymous, and we all signed up for it after that. Like, that's in my mind, that's how that's conjured up. Bill and Bob got together, they worked this thing out, and we all just somehow or another signed up, but that's not what happened. That's not what happened. Alcoholism was a problem for human beings for thousands of years with no solution. And it's hard for me, and it's one of the reasons why I love the Big Book, because the Big Book is the story of what happened, which is an important story, because understanding what happened, and that's why it's written that's why when we read the steps and other things of how it works, this is our experience, they're saying. They're saying this is what we did, this is how we felt, this is the results we got. They're telling their experience. They're not saying what you should do, they're not saying what is, they're just saying, look, here's the way it was with us, here's the things that we did, here's the results we got, maybe you can try it too. And recovery from alcoholism or 12-step program is really just an invitation. Nobody here is telling anybody what they have to do, right? It's an invitation. It's, hey, here's what we found. Maybe you could try that and have it work for you too. And the Big Book is the de facto story of what happened in the 1930s, where humankind went from no recovery to recovery, right? And there's been recovery ever since. Something happened in the 1930s. And believe me, Bill and Bob are pretty smart people, but they weren't smart enough to figure out what we needed to do, right? And so what happened is that Bill is seen by a doctor in New York who tells him his problem, the allergy of the body, the obsession of the mind. Did that get Bill sober? No, of course not. Now, of course, the first thing Bill did is say, well, now that I know that I have this allergy and I have this obsession, there's no possible chance I could ever drink again. Wrong, right? Within a month, he was drunk again, right? And so then he went back to the hospital several months later, and he overhears his wife being consulted by the doctor saying, look, you're going to have to hire a bodyguard or lock him up. He's going to have a wet brain or be dead within a year. I mean, this is serious stuff. He is deep in it. He is a chronic alcoholic in late stages, and he is in physical trouble. He overhears the doctor telling his wife this, and he says fear sobered him for a bit, but not for very long. Now, he says in the book a few months. This is the great thing about Bill. He's one of us. In every way. He's one of us. I don't want to take anything away from him. We're not here if it's not for Bill. And AA doesn't leave Akron if it's just Dr. Bob. So that's not, I'm not here but yet we have to understand this book is written by somebody who's just like us. He exaggerates. Lois remembers. And she said it was a month, right? So Bill is drunk again, right? And this time he stays drunk until his friend Ebby visits him. And Ebby comes to Bill's home after being sober for 2 months. And he tells Bill how. He says, and here's the thing. This 12-step call didn't need to start with qualification. Ebby didn't have to tell Bill about his drinking and the trouble it had been causing him, because Ebby and Bill had been drinking together since boarding school, right? So Bill is very familiar with all of the trouble that Ebby. Matter of fact, when Ebby telephoned Bill was wondering how he had escaped the mental institution that he had heard Ebby was about to get locked up in Vermont, right? So he's wondering, how the heck did Ebby escape? So Bill's very well aware of Ebby's drinking, its consequences, and even the most recent trouble that he's been in drinking, and he's thinking that Ebby must be on the run. And so Ebby shows up in Bill's kitchen, though, sober, and he's been sober for a couple of months. And he shares with Bill the fact that he had a spiritual experience and that spiritual experience enabled him not to drink anymore. And he also shared with Bill how he had that spiritual experience, the steps that the Oxford groups taught him and that enabled him to unlock that spiritual experience. He brings to Bill the solution to alcoholism, which is a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening, and he brings to Bill a method, a set of steps that he could take that would produce such an experience. When Ebby does this, when this meeting happens in Bill's kitchen, Bill Wilson becomes the first person in any written history anywhere to know all three things needed in order to recover from alcoholism. What is the problem? What is the solution? And what's the program of action? How do you get from the problem to the solution? When Ebby visits with Bill is the first one to know all three pieces of that puzzle. The big book is the story of that happening and what's happened ever since. And so this wasn't like sat around and thought about by alcoholics. Like, how can we get these alcoholics sober? Let's figure out a way. This was like stumbled upon. And I didn't know that as a person coming into AA. I didn't know. The other thing that was, I think, made it harder for me to understand what AA was and how it worked was that I didn't appreciate the unique opportunity that we all have. Every person in this room who suffers from alcoholism has won the lottery, in a sense. Alcoholism has been around for thousands of years. Solomon is writing about alcoholism in the Bible, for God's sakes, but has no solution for it, right? So the stories of what happens with alcoholics, people like us, once drinking gets a hold of us, have been around for a long time. But stories of recovery from that problem are non-existent until almost until Alcoholics Anonymous. There's a little things that come up and peter out right before Alcoholics Anonymous, but basically nothing stuck until Alcoholics Anonymous. As long as I've been alive, there's been recovery from alcoholism. I've never known a time when alcoholism was discussed as a hopeless condition of mind and body. I've never known that time. As long as I've been alive, before I even knew what alcoholism was or anything, if it was ever brought up, if somebody had an addiction problem, there was the context of the conversation about that person from one person to another, if I was overhearing it or whatever, has always been, oh, he's sick, there must be someplace he can get the help. I mean, there might be judgment and stuff like that involved, but there's never been a time that I've been alive where somebody didn't have some possibility of going and getting help for that. That's not the case in the 1930s. When Ebby visits Bill in his kitchen at that Clinton Street home, there's no history whatsoever of people recovering from alcoholism except for the very small history that Ebby has been a part of around the Oxford groups and these drunks that got sober there, right? That's the only thing that exists, right? Bill doesn't know anything about it. And so the book uses terms like hopeless condition of mind and body to describe the state of an alcoholic because that was the state at the time. That was it. I've never known that time. Right? As long as I've been alive, there's been recovery from alcoholism. So this opportunity that we have is like we hit the lottery. If I'd been born 100 years before, right? Now, what about the people that are going to be born 100 years from now? Well, the possibility of them knowing that there is a thing called recovery from alcoholism is on your and my shoulders, right? And that's why we have the traditions. So the second step, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity, is not a trick. It's not a game that anybody's playing to try to trick you into believing in God. It is just simply the reality that Ebby found himself absolutely unable to stay sober, found these Oxford group. These Oxford groupers actually got him released from from the judge. Instead of going to the state mental hospital, he was released into a couple of drunks' care in the Oxford groups. Ebby followed their suggestions, and Ebby had a spiritual experience, and he carried that message to Bill. Bill was last gasping drunk. He's about to be committed. He's going to have wet brain. He's going to be locked up. I mean, he's in desperate spot. He accepts what Ebby has to offer. Not easily, by the way. even as bad as Bill is, if you read his story, you can see the resistance he has to believing in a power greater than himself. He is absolutely not happy about this solution. And again, thank God it's him that writes the book, right? Because he's not trying to sell us anything. As a matter of fact, he was as skeptical as any of us could ever possibly be, right? But at the end of the day, he had two things. He had drinking and dying, which he knew was coming, and he had this unlikely, barely palatable possibility of living a spiritual life. And he almost chose drinking and dying. Can you imagine, right? Right? He almost chose drinking and dying, but instead he chose to believe, right? At one point, my favorite line in the big book, I think, is in the chapter We Agnostics. Because at the end of the paragraph it says, what was our choice to be? And really, everything up until that line is the conversation in my head about, why not? Is there proof? What does he look like? Which direction? What am I supposed to call him? There's all this stuff that's going on in our head, because that's what happens. When we mention God or spirituality or believing in a power greater than ourselves, we have all this stuff that we think we got to sort out and know. And at the end of the day, if I look back at my experience, here's what happened. A guy told me a story about the miracle that God had created in his life that enabled him complete release from addiction and alcoholism. And I believed it. Now, probably up until I really understood that sentence, what was my choice to be, I thought that Melvin had proven that God existed. The telling of his story was a testimony of God's existence, and I felt it was proof that God existed. It wasn't proof that God existed. It was just a story that allowed me to make a different choice. It allowed me to choose that God is, that God exists, and start to live like maybe that was possible and move in a different direction. That's what happened. At the end of the day, it was just my choice. So how does the big book, which is the textbook Alcoholics Anonymous, deal with this subject? It bounces around between step 1 and step 2 for 4 chapters, right? So it tells us Bill's story after the doctor's opinion. It tells us Bill's story, and then it gives us a chapter on the solution, stating basically unequivocally that a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening is the answer to alcoholism. Ideas, attitudes, and emotions that were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men were cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives began to dominate them. A spiritual experience. There's a whole appendix on it in the back of the book, because in early days in Alcoholics Anonymous, there was a lot of confusion. People read what happened to Bill. Bill goes to Towns Hospital after this meeting with Ebby, not right away, but a few weeks later. He ends up in Towns Hospital, he dries out, and while he's at Towns Hospital, he goes through the steps and has a spiritual experience, a dramatic spiritual experience, a white flash, he says, like the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. That God comes to most men gradually, he says, but his impact on me was sudden and profound, right? He's describing a spiritual experience of the quick kind, right? And a lot of people who read the big book early on were reading experiences like Bill's, and when they weren't having these dramatic, quick spiritual experiences, they began to think that they were doing something wrong. So they were writing into the Alcoholic Foundation, and it is really warm in here. Turn all the fans up. They wrote into the Alcoholic Foundation, or what we call General Service now, and they were writing letters into the foundation like, "Hey, what did we do wrong? We followed your instructions perfectly, and we didn't have this white, great, clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through." And so they wrote this spiritual experience appendix so that we would all understand that some people have this quick, dramatic change, but that most of us are going to have the educational variety, spiritual awakening, the slower type that takes place over a few months instead of this, rapid, all of a sudden change. But Bill has this all of a sudden change. By the way, he has that change while he's in Towns Hospital, which is a detox. So here he is in detox, maybe 7 days, maybe 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, if his insurance is really good. And while he's there, Ebby visits with him. He goes through the 12 steps while he's there and has this dramatic spiritual experience, right? That's what it says at the end of his story on page 12, right? And so he takes all 12 steps in Pound's hospital within his first couple of weeks of sobriety and recovers to never drink again. Now, I'm not saying that that's how you've got to work the steps, right? I would never say that, right? I'm just saying that let's hold that as a possibility. I understand that some people take a step a year, a step a year. And you know what? I'm not here to even say that that's wrong. It sounds ridiculous to me, but I'm not here to say it's wrong. But let's remember that in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous, let's take just Dr. Bob, who sponsored 5,000 alcoholics, reportedly. I mean, he wouldn't let anybody else in Akron sponsor anybody who was part of it. But 5,000 alcoholics later, most of them, after being sober for 10 days to 2 weeks, came over to his office on a Saturday afternoon, and they worked the entire program in an afternoon. And that was how so the majority of people in Alcoholics Anonymous in early days were working the steps within their first weeks of sobriety, and they were doing it rather quickly. Again, it doesn't have to look like that for anybody. The Big Book never says you have to do it in this time frame, and it never says anything like that. But if we've got a step a year on one side of the spectrum, let's get a step every 30 minutes on the other side of the perspective and try to meet somewhere in there, right? At least know what's possible. There is a solution, describes the solution, the spiritual experience, this rearrangement of attitudes, ideas, and emotions, and tells us that that's the solution. And then they go back into the problem. They tell us what the solution is, and they know. Bill's the primary author of the text. Bill says, no. I remember my reaction the first time somebody told me the solution. It was almost, no thanks, I'd rather drink and die. So let me explain to these folks exactly what's going to happen if they don't have a spiritual experience and they are a real alcoholic. And so he writes the chapter more about alcoholism, chapter 3, so that we understand exactly what will happen, exactly what the problem is. And in this chapter, he gives these normal stories. 2 of them are real stories of people who were members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and another one was pulled out of a book that the Oxford group, or was used around the Oxford groups. I forget the book's name. Pat would know, though, if you want to call him, or Tom. These stories, though, are of real people who were sober after having really bad problems with alcohol, having members of Alcoholics Anonymous see them, or 2 of the stories were about having members of Alcoholics Anonymous see them and how they succumbed to the drink again. And they're stories of exactly what happened in their minds, right? And one of them was a guy named Jim who was having a terrible, terrible day. And he was working for this place that he had once owned. And he was really, you can see in the story that he's not really having the best day of his life, right? And before he drinks, though, he drives into the country and goes to a roadside place where they have a bar because he's hungry. And he stops in to have a sandwich and a glass of milk. He's a little hungrier than normal, so he has another sandwich and another glass of milk, which there's no problem with that unless you're a member of Overeaters Anonymous, right? And then he thinks it's okay. Maybe if I take whiskey with milk, it couldn't possibly hurt me on a full stomach, right? And that part of the language is in italics. Right? It's in this lettering that's like stands out. It's like, here's a normal alcoholic having a bad day, and here's crazy, right? Just absolutely nuts that you think you can take whiskey if you mix it with milk as long as you have a full stomach. Like, it's absolutely crazy. But isn't that like how it occurs? Right? It never, like we think we know what crazy is. I think I would recognize crazy if I see it. And I do. I recognize crazy when it's you. When you do something crazy, I can tell you that's crazy, right? But when crazy is happening up here, it seems perfectly normal. I cannot distinguish the crazy up here from the absolutely sane and normal thinking. And so I had this crazy idea that I can go out with the folks at my new job because I'm doing really, really well. It's been weeks since I've been out of jail. I finally got a paycheck and had met some new people who were not the people that I used to drink with that got me all that trouble in the first place. This is crazy thinking, right? But it occurs to me perfectly sane and rational. And so I go out to the bar on a Friday with my new friends from my new job, weeks after reeling from the last debacle and just getting out of jail. And of course, the problem is that at 10 o'clock, they're all going home, and I'm not, and I can't stop. Right? I'm started, but I cannot stop. All of the sane people go home, and I go somewhere else. So the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind. It was important that I understood that I had an allergy to alcohol, that once I started, I could not stop. But that's not really my main problem, right? The main problem of an alcoholic centers in his mind. I am different than a guy who's allergic to bananas. I mean, if you're allergic to bananas, you go see a doctor, he does a test, he says you're allergic to bananas. And the solution is, don't eat bananas. Right? That's the solution, right? You don't go 2 weeks later and go, oh, it's those damn Chiquita bananas. I'm going to eat Dole bananas and I'll be okay, right? Or it's the people I've been eating bananas with, right? That never occurs to you, right? Because the physical allergy is not my problem. It's a problem for sure. I can't drink without aggravating the allergy, but that's not my real problem, is it? My real problem is that 3 weeks out of jail, I think I can drink, even though every other time I've drank, I didn't stop until I was in jail. And I think I can drink without going to jail. It's never happened. I've never drank and not ended up in jail. I'm not talking about the same night. Sometimes it takes weeks or months for you to go to jail, but I've never drank and had it end before going to jail. I'm always getting drunk and high every day until I'm in jail, right? Every time. This is, the 17th time. And I'm out of jail for 3 weeks, and I know that I can take a drink. It's only going to be tonight, and nobody's going to know. Where does that come from? It's crazy. It's nuts. It's insane, right? So when the second step says, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity, that's what they're talking about. And if you can identify with these crazy thoughts that occur in the mind just before taking a drink, that fly in the face of all experience to the contrary, you might just be one of us. Now that's bad news. It's good news and bad news, right? But it's bad news first, because it means, look, that's powerlessness. That's what it means, to not have a choice. I can't control it once I start, and I can't stop from starting. I am absolutely powerless. That means I'm screwed. I got no way out. This is bad, right? I can't do it. But a power greater than myself can restore me to sanity. A power greater, Alcoholics Anonymous is saying, experience after experience after experience, that people in AA have found a solution in those steps that has enabled them to come into contact with a power greater than themselves that has restored them to sanity. And now I'm one of those people. And here's the good news. The bad news is bad. You're screwed if you can identify with allergy of the body and obsession of the mind. That's bad. This is a deadly illness. This is not to be messed around with. People die all of the time from alcoholism. That's bad news. But the good news is that AA's solution is much better than any of my trying to stay sober before. Because every time I tried to stay sober before, it looked a little bit like thinking about drinking until I was drinking, right? I mean, I would think about drinking, that's a thought. I would think about drinking, that's a thought. And then eventually I would think about drinking until I was drinking, right? And that's an obsession. That's crazy. That's insanity, right? Alcoholics Anonymous is offering a way out where I don't have that, where I don't believe. Right? And so for nearly 30 years, I've lived a life where not only am I not drinking, I don't even think about drinking. I mean, That's not exactly true. It's not like I've never think about drinking. I just have actually never thought about pouring one in my mouth. That's different, right? I've seen some people drinking and go, oh, isn't that fun? It wouldn't work for me, but it looks great over there, right? I've had that thought, right? But it's never been, I think I can join them. That thought has never occurred. And so the cool thing about Alcoholics Anonymous is that they're offering a solution. Yeah, it looks like going to meetings. It looks like working steps. This all looks like really hard work when you're new and it's unfamiliar and you're trying to sort it all out. But at the end of the day, what we learn in Alcoholics Anonymous is a way of life that becomes familiar and repetitive and normal. Right? At first, it looks abnormal. It's up there on the wall, and it's in this funny book, and it just looks weird and abnormal, right? But today, years later, it's perfectly normal. It's like a normal way to live a life. It's really not complicated. I follow a few simple rules, and guess what? I get to live my life without having to think about drinking, which is, if you think about it, it's a miracle. That's crazy. I could not ever not think about drinking. Right? But for 30 years almost, I've not thought about drinking. That's like nuts. I would have sacrificed so much more to have that. Doing some silly things that I don't understand and having to follow people's suggestions and read this stupid book and it all seemed like a lot to ask in the beginning, right? But that's really I would have given up. I would have given so much more than what Alcoholics Anonymous has asked for complete freedom from the obsession to drink, right? Which is what they gave me, right? And another cool thing about AA and AA's solution is that not drinking and not even wanting or thinking about drinking would seem like that is like the biggest deal to anybody like me who couldn't stay sober for even a month, right? It would seem like in the time that you've been sober, that must be, sobriety itself must be the biggest benefit of this entire thing. And it's not. And it's not. Because Alcoholics Anonymous has provided a way of life that has unlocked happiness and peace and serenity. It has unlocked a way of being in the world that brings such joy and happiness and serenity at times, maybe not all the time, right? We're all human still, right? But at times, that was absolutely unknown to me prior to coming into Alcoholics Anonymous. So sobriety sounds like it should be the biggest freaking deal ever that Alcoholics Anonymous gave me. And as I look back at my time in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's just absolutely not. Alcoholics Anonymous, this program and practicing these steps have given me so much more than just sobriety. The entire existence of my life and everything that I look around in my life today is an absolute miracle. It brings me absolute joy, and I was not even aware of those possibilities prior to coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't even know that it was possible to live and be in the world this way. And so on top of the fact that you get sobriety would have been enough. That's all I was signing up for, was sobriety. I didn't care anything about spirituality. That's not why I came to AA. I didn't come to AA because I love spiritual principles and I want to do yoga and meditate. I came here because I could not stop drinking. And I accepted this spiritual thing because you said it was necessary in order for me to reach a state where I didn't have to drink. And then on the other side, I come to find out that this way of life is so much better than anything that I was even aware of prior to it. It's absolutely amazing, right? And so for people who are struggling, for people who are here and you don't believe in God or you're struggling with the God idea, let me just tell you some of that. In my experience, working with alcoholics and even my own personal experience at different times with believing in God, that most of the problem surrounding the second step, most of the resistance, I think even Bill would say this himself, most of the resistance about the second step, about coming to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity, has to do with this realm of what we think we already know. We come into Alcoholics Anonymous they say power greater than ourselves, and then they say God in the third step, and we go, I knew they were just hoodwinking me in step 2, and we know that this is about God. It's not that we know this is about God. It's that when that idea is introduced, I have a frame of reference for what you were talking about. Right? I know God. God's this, tall, gray-haired, gray beard, white robe, big letter G, big stick, lives on a cloud. Every one of us, when we introduce the idea of God or a power greater than us, has this image somewhere that I'm sure I got that one out of a kid's book or something, but that was the image I had. When you said God, that was what I conjured up, and that's what I assumed that you were talking about, right? And here's the biggest thing you gotta know about step 2. Whatever that image is that gets conjured up for you, when you came to Alcoholics Anonymous and we said power greater than yourself or God, whatever that image is, whatever it is that you think that we're talking about, the most important thing you gotta understand is that that's not what we're talking about. Whatever that is, it's not what we're talking about. Like, I had no idea what they were talking about. I assumed I knew what you were talking about. Because I've been to church. I was a Catholic. I knew what this, I had this whole picture. I absolutely knew what you were talking about. And guess what? I didn't have a clue. I knew nothing about the subject. I had no idea what you were going to bring me to in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, despite what it is I thought that I knew, right? Didn't matter. I came into AA, a born-again Christian, out of prison. Thought I knew what you were talking about. My sponsor and I, we skipped chapter 5. Because we already believed. I didn't need that. Oh my God, what a mistake. Not chapter 5, chapter 4. We agnostics, right? We skipped chapter 4 because I was a believer already. Right? We didn't need to do that, right? And here's the thing. It sounds like chapter 4 is trying to convince atheists and agnostics to believe in God. That's not what it is. It's trying to ask everybody, whether you're an atheist, an agnostic. It's talking to the agnostic and atheist, so we can't deny that fact. It is. It applies to the believer as well. But the chapter is trying to convince atheists and agnostics to believe in God. It's asking atheists and agnostics to lay aside what they think they already know about the subject so that there might be some possibility of some new experience. Right? That's what chapter 4 is about. The same applies to believers. If you come to Alcoholics Anonymous and your God cup is already full, you can't get there from here. You got to be able to empty that cup out to learn anything new. That was my problem. My problem was I thought I already had the God stuff figured out. I was just going to the meetings and talking to my sponsor and I thought that part was already done. And little did I know that my biggest struggle was because I hadn't admitted that I was powerless, I never fully accepted your solution. But once I accepted that I was powerless, all of a sudden now I knew there's a whole bunch of stuff that I don't know, and I better get to unlearning, right? Because I had to unlearn. The Alcoholics Anonymous is not a program of addition, it's a program of subtraction. It's asking me to let go of the stuff that I think that I already know so that I might have a new experience. That applies to atheists, that applies to agnostics, and it applies to believers. Just set it aside and be open to some new possibility. Thanks.